The hall was silent enough to hear a needle drop. 10 noble daughters, dressed in silk, groomed for months, each carrying the weight of her family's ambition, stood in a perfect line before the most powerful duke in the northern lands. Every eye in the room followed him as he walked the length of that line. He passed the first woman, the second, the seventh. He didn't pause once. Then he stopped. Not in front of any of them. He was looking at the far corner, at a girl in a plain ivory dress, ink-stained fingers, mending someone else's torn hem. She hadn't been introduced. She wasn't on any list. She wasn't even a candidate. And yet, in front of 30 witnesses, Duke Calder Reinhardt pointed directly at her and said, in a voice that needed no volume to fill the room, "Give me the one they call worthless." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Why would the most sought-after duke in the realm reject 10 noble daughters to choose the one girl everyone had already forgotten? Stay with us, because the answer will change everything you think you know about this story. The great hall of Ashenvale Keep had never been so quiet. Frost still clung to the stone arches where the morning had not yet reached, and the fires in the twin hearths burned low, more for ceremony than warmth. 10 women stood in a precise line across the rushes, the finest daughters of 5 northern earldoms, summoned by the Dowager Duchess Heloise Reinhardt, in the manner of a general who had simply run out of patience. They had traveled through snow. They had mended torn hems in jolting carriages and repinned their hair by candlelight in cold roadside inns. Their cloaks were brushed, their silver clasps polished. Their mothers, who had not slept in 3 nights, had drilled into them the precise angle of a curtsy, the approved topics of polite conversation, the exact weight of a smile that said, "I am accomplished and amiable and will not be difficult to manage." Each one of them believed, with the certainty of a woman who had been told so repeatedly, that her future had already been decided. Duke Calder Reinhardt walked in through the western door. He did not announce himself. He gave no greeting. He handed his riding gloves to the footman at his left without looking at him, straightened the single silver brooch at his collar, a wolf's head, the Reinhardt sigil, and turned to face the assembled company with the calm of a man who had somewhere more important to be and was uncertain whether this was worth his time. He was tall. That was the first thing Ilara Vane noticed, though she was not supposed to be noticing anything. She was sitting on a low stool near the eastern hearth, a torn hem spread across her lap, a needle between her fingers. She had been stitching for half an hour with the quiet purposefulness of someone who had made herself invisible so thoroughly that she had almost convinced herself she was. She was 22 years old. She was the niece of Lady Farrow, brought to Ashenvale not as a candidate, but as an extra pair of hands. She mended things. She fetched things. She remembered which cousin needed her brooch reattached before the midday meal, and which one grew impossible when her hair wasn't pinned correctly by someone who actually knew how. She was, in the polite language of the North, useful. In the less polite language, which she had heard murmured at enough county assemblies to know its precise shape and weight, she was nothing to worry about. She was trying very hard not to watch the Duke. She failed. He was not handsome the way the stories said he was, not the smooth, arranged handsomeness of a man who knows he is being looked at. He was something more troubling than that. Broad through the shoulders, jaw set with a kind of habitual resolution, dark hair worn close. And his eyes, she caught them for only a moment as they moved across the room, were a deep storm gray, the color of the fjord in winter, and they moved with the particular quality of a man who was searching for something specific and had already accepted that it would not be where everyone expected it. He passed the first woman in the line, then the second. The third gave a small, careful curtsy, and he did not even slow. By the 6th, someone near the back wall had pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. He stopped. Not in front of any of the 10 women. He was looking past them, past the hanging furs and the copper candle stands and the elaborate flower arrangements that had been shipped from the southern ports at considerable expense. He was looking at the far eastern corner of the hall, where the fire was lowest and the light was worst. Where Ilara sat with a needle in her hand and a torn hymn in her lap, and what she would later describe to Tilda as the particular expression of someone who has just realized the wolf has noticed the corner. The silence stretched like ice over deep water. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It never needed to be. "Give me the one they call worthless." No one moved. The matchmaker, a formidable woman named Sigrid Morel, who had arranged 30 years of noble marriages across 4 northern duchies, and had never once been caught without the appropriate response, opened her mouth and found, for the first time in her professional life, that nothing came out. It was Lady Farrow who recovered first. She crossed the hall in 6 swift strides, and positioned herself between Ilara and the Duke's line of sight with the particular boldness of a woman who has 3 daughters still in the running and a great deal at stake. "Your Grace." Her voice was controlled, each word like a stone placed carefully on ice. "I must respectfully clarify, my niece is here in a supporting role only. She was not presented. She is not a candidate. She has no—" "What is her name?" It was not a question. Lady Farrow's jaw tightened by a degree that only someone watching closely would have noted. "Ilara Vane, Your Grace. My late sister's daughter. She has no formal establishment, no—" "Bring her forward." Ilara set down her needle. She did it carefully because she was the sort of person who completed small tasks before moving on to larger confusions, and she rose from the stool with her hem half-stitched still draped over her arm. She looked at the Duke from across the hall. She looked behind herself to confirm he was not, in fact, staring at the tapestry. He was not. She walked forward. Later, much later in a different life, she would try to remember what she had felt in that walk across the rushes, with the eyes of 30 people pressing against her back like cold fingers. She would not find a clean word for it. Not fear, though her heartbeat had gone strange and quick. Not pride, though her chin had lifted by some instinct older than thought. Something in the narrow space between those two things, where a person discovers they are more than they had been told. She stopped 3 feet from him. Up close, his eyes were not entirely gray. There were darker threads in them, almost black, the way storm clouds have depths that the distance hides. He looked at her with the same focused attention he had given to nothing else in the room, and she held his gaze because she had decided, in the 3 seconds of that walk, that she was done pretending not to be there. "You have ink on your thumb," he said. "I do," she said. "From what?" "I was copying out the matchmaker's guest list this morning. Her handwriting is difficult to read." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the architecture of one. The bones of it, present but uncommitted. "You were here as a candidate, asked to perform the work of a secretary." "I was here as a helper," she said, "and the work needed doing." Behind her she heard Lady Farrow make a sound like a woman swallowing something sharp. The Duke looked at her for another moment, the kind of look that did not perform anything, did not ask for anything, simply looked, with the clean attention of someone who has stopped pretending the interesting thing is where everyone said it would be. "Clear the room," he said. The East Garden at Ashenvale Keep was not beautiful in winter. It was bare and still, the climbing roses stripped down to their thorned gray stems against the pale stone wall, the flower beds turned and sleeping under a thin skin of frost. The birch trees at the garden's edge held their white branches up against a sky the color of old iron, and the gravel path between the beds crunched under boots with the particular sound that belongs only to mornings before anyone else has passed through them. Ilara had told herself she was going for a walk. She had not been convincing. He was already there, standing near the low wall, a cup of something steaming held loosely in one hand, looking out at the bare rose stems with the expression of a man who had been awake for a long time and had made peace with it. He had dressed without ceremony, dark wool trousers, a charcoal waistcoat over a white shirt, no formal coat. The cold did not seem to trouble him. He looked more human than he had the day before in the great hall, and somehow that was worse. Less like a title, more like a person, which presented its own complications. He turned at the sound of her footsteps on the gravel. You came. I told myself I was only walking. And I am clearly unconvincing, even to myself. She stopped a few feet from him, pulling her wool cloak tighter against the coal. The garden smelled of frost and old stone, and the faint ghost of something green beneath the dormant earth. The smell of things waiting, patient, certain they would return. He held out the cup. She looked at it. That is your cup. I haven't drunk from it. I had it brought out and then forgot about it while I was thinking. She took it. The ceramic was warm against her palms. The tea was still good, just past the point of too hot, which meant his thinking had gone on longer than he'd planned. She drank a small mouthful and handed it back. What were you thinking about? Yesterday, he said. Specifically the expression on Sigrid Morel's face when I asked her to stay as chaperone. Ilara almost smiled. She's going to put this in her professional record. She keeps records? Every matchmaker in the North keeps records. It is the only way to survive 30 years of watching noble families make catastrophic decisions and remain employed. She turned to look at the wall, at the bare rose stems curling against the stone. Something in her loosened, just slightly, just enough to let breath come more easily. He was not what she had expected. She had expected performance. Grandeur, totale. The particular kind of authority that announced itself loudly and left no room for questions. Instead, there was this. A man standing in a cold garden before breakfast, sharing tea he had forgotten to drink, willing to wait in silence without needing to fill it. Your Grace, she said carefully. I want to understand what happened yesterday. Not the version of it that makes a good story. The plain version. He was quiet for a moment. She had noticed this about him already. That he did not answer quickly, not because he was uncertain, but because he was deciding on the exact truth rather than the approximate one. 7 months ago, he said, at the Kettermere Autumn Assembly, a groom in my household named Silas watched a woman untangle 3 panicked horses that an attendant had tethered too close together. She calmed the nearest one, cleared the leads, and stepped back before anyone thought to thank her. He described her in his weekly report as the only person who moved toward the problem instead of away from it. Ilara remembered the horses. She remembered the frantic pull of the leads, the white-rimmed eyes, the particular quality of a fear that could tip into catastrophe if no one moved in the next 10 seconds. She had moved. He described you as useful, Calder said, which is how I came to know your name. The wind moved through the birch branches above the wall, a dry whispering sound, like pages turning. And when I arrived yesterday and looked at the room, he continued, I heard 2 women near the doorway refer to you in a different way. Only Lady Farrow's worthless niece, not worth considering. He paused. I found it interesting, he said, that the same woman my man called useful was the woman those others called worthless. I wanted to know which of them had looked at you correctly. Ilara was quiet for a moment. The cold bit at her cheeks, at the tips of her fingers around the warm ceramic he had handed back to her. She turned to look at him, at the serious, unhurried profile, the jaw set with that habitual resolution, the storm-gray eyes that were looking at the garden and nowhere else. And have you decided? She said. Not yet, he said. That is why I am here. She looked down at her thumb, where the ink stain still sat stubbornly at the edge of her nail. She had scrubbed at it the night before. It had not moved. "I should tell you," she said, "that I am not practiced at this kind of thing. Conversations with intention. Conversations that might become something." "Neither am I," he said, without apology, without performance, simply as a fact. She looked at him. Something happened in the space between those words and the silence that followed them. Something small and specific, like the first crack in river ice in early spring, barely audible, easily missed, but the beginning of an irrevocable change. She was not going to examine it. Not yet. "If we are going to speak honestly," she said, "then I should tell you something you will likely hear from another source soon, and I would rather you hear it from me first." He turned toward her then, the full attention of those gray eyes, without the wall she had expected to find there, without the managed distance, just present, just looking. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him plainly, without decoration or apology, the way she had decided on the walk down the corridor the night before, after Tilda had gone to sleep and she had sat by the window watching the Ashenvale torches burn against the dark. She told him about her father's debt, the loan against the eastern field, borrowed when the harvest failed 3 years in a row, and the pride of a man who had never asked for help collided with the necessity of a man who had run out of options. She told him about the boundary dispute, now 2 years old, still unresolved, a wound that kept reopening in the court. She told him about the lender's patience, which was not bottomless. She told him that if the boundary question resolved badly, the eastern field's value collapsed, the lender could call the debt, and she and her mother would lose the house. She told him about Lord Howick Fenn, Lady Mirabel's cousin, who had arrived the previous afternoon and had referenced the land dispute by name within 3 hours, in the studied casual manner of a man who had done his research before breakfast. "He will use it," she said. "He will frame it as a scandal, a financial liability, a woman performing helplessness to generate sympathy. If I do not tell you first, you will hear it in that frame, and the frame will color everything." The frost had begun to melt off the stone wall behind her. Small drips of water caught the early light and fell onto the gravel, each one making a sound as soft as a whispered word. Calder was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had not changed in warmth, but something in it had gone very still, the way water goes still before it moves fast. "Who holds the debt?" She told him. Something crossed his face, brief and specific, a flash of recognition she could not yet read. "My father also left complexity," he said after a moment. "Not at this scale, but the estate I inherited at 23 was more troubled than anyone had told me. I spent 3 years unknotting it before I could do anything else." He looked at her. "I do not confuse circumstance with character. What you are describing is not a failing. It is a thing that happened to you." She breathed out slowly. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding the breath. "Thank you for telling me before Howick had the chance," he said. "I moved toward the problem," she said quietly. "It is the only thing I know how to do." And now he did smile, actually smiled, not the architecture of one but the real thing, brief and unguarded. There and gone so fast she might have doubted it if it hadn't rearranged something fundamental in her chest. "I know," he said. "That is exactly why I am standing in a cold garden before breakfast." She looked away before he could see whatever was happening on her face. The bare roses held their thorns against the pale stone. Above them, the first birds of morning had begun. Small sounds, tentative, the sound of a world remembering it was alive. Lord Howick Fenn was 41 years old, lean and pleasant-faced, with pale eyes that did not match the pleasantness. He had arrived at Ashenvale, keep the afternoon before, under the pretext of visiting his cousin Lady Mirabel, and he had spent that evening in the great hall being agreeable to everyone and watching Ilara Vane with the quiet, patient attention of a man cataloguing weaknesses. At breakfast the following morning, Lady Mirabelle deployed him. She did it skillfully, the way a woman does who has spent years sharpening a weapon and is finally in range of her target. She asked in her warmest voice, with her sweetest smile, whether anyone had heard about the recent difficulties some families in the hill counties had been facing, regarding inheritance and unpaid obligations, and the particular sadness of estates that looked stable on the surface while the ground beneath shifted. She addressed it to the table in general. She did not look at Ilara. She didn't need to. Everyone else did. Tilda's foot found Ilara's under the table and pressed once, firm and deliberate. "I see it. I'm here." Ilara set down her cup. She looked at Lady Mirabelle with the level, unafraid gaze she had learned long ago, the one that came from watching too many people perform cruelty and waiting for the moment they expected her to flinch. "If you have something to say to me," she said quietly enough that it didn't carry past the nearest 3 seats, "I would prefer you said it plainly." The table went very still. Lady Mirabelle's smile did not waver. She was good. Ilara had to grant her that. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Mirabelle said warmly. "I was speaking in general terms." "Of course," Ilara said. "How interesting that the general terms fit so precisely." Across the table, Delia Farrow, Ilara's middle cousin, who had treated her for 3 years with the warmth of someone regarding useful furniture, looked up from her plate. She looked at Mirabelle, then at Ilara, then back at her plate, with an expression that had gone very flat and very precise. It was, Ilara would think later, the first time Delia had ever looked at her like an ally. The Duke arrived late to breakfast. He entered from the side door, already dressed for the day, and took his seat at the head of the table with the unhurried manner of a man who had already accomplished several things before the rest of the house had finished sleeping. He looked at the table, at the particular quality of the silence, and in one sweeping assessment understood exactly what had just occurred. He said nothing. He accepted his bread and looked at Hawick Fen once, just once, briefly, the way a man checks the weight of something before deciding whether to carry it or put it down, and then looked away. But Hawick had gone still. Ilara had noticed. She suspected Tilda had noticed. She suspected that Delia, who was the most perceptive person in the Farrow family, even if she had never bothered to deploy that perception on Ilara's behalf, had also noticed. Hawick had not expected the Duke to already know. That miscalculation, small as it looked over morning bread and salt fish, was the beginning of the end of his strategy. The library on the upper floor of Ashenvale Keep had no south-facing windows. It was cold and dark for most of the morning, and by afternoon it received exactly 2 hours of thin winter light through the narrow northern panes before the shadows reclaimed it. For these reasons, no one used it who didn't have to. Ilara had found it on her first day, and had loved it immediately. She was there when the Dowager Duchess Heloise found her. The Dowager was 71 years old, and did not waste words. She walked through the library with the ease of a woman who had been doing so for 50 years, settled into the leather chair near the window, and looked at Ilara with clear, unsentimental eyes. "You did not come here expecting any of this." "No," Ilara said. "And you were not sure what to make of my grandson." "I am still deciding." The Dowager made a small sound of approval. "Good. Anyone who was certain of Calder within 48 hours would worry me." She looked at her hands for a moment. "I arranged this selection because he needed to be pushed. He is very good at managing things and very reluctant to want them. Do you understand the difference?" "I think so." "Managing is safe," the Dowager said. "Wanting is a vulnerability. He has spent 8 years avoiding vulnerability." She paused. "He has not looked at a room the way he looked at that corner since before his father died." Ilara was quiet. The cold pressed at the window glass. Outside, the bare branches of the birch trees moved in the wind, making their dry paper sound. "I'm telling you this not to pressure you," the dowager said. "I'm telling you because you deserve the whole picture." She stood, smoothed her heavy skirts, and moved toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. Lady Mirabelle wrote 2 letters this morning, one to her mother, one to Lord Hawick Fen before he arrived. I know this because I have lived in this keep for 50 years and the staff tell me things. The cold in the library was no different than it had been a moment ago. But Ilara felt it differently. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you," the dowager said. "I'm telling you because what is coming will be designed to make you look small. And I want you to know in advance that it is coming, so that when it arrives, you do not mistake it for truth." She left. Ilara sat in the cold library for a long time. She thought about Hawick Fen's pale eyes at dinner, the way he had mentioned the land dispute, like setting a small stone in her path. She thought about Calder standing in the garden at dawn, sharing tea he'd forgotten to drink. "Know what you value." That was what the dowager had said. "Make sure you know what you value before this week is finished." She knew. She went to find Tilda. Tilda was 17 and sharp as a winter blade, and when Ilara told her everything, the debt, the land dispute, Hawick, the dowager's warning, she set down her embroidery and looked at her cousin with the calm, focused eyes of someone far older than her years. "Then we need to be smarter than Mirabelle before Thursday," Tilda said. "We're not plotting anything." "We are preparing," Tilda said firmly. "There is a meaningful difference." Below the sitting room window, a rider came through the keep gates at a pace that suggested urgency. Tilda watched him with narrowed eyes. "Who is that?" They would learn his name later. Thomas Grieve, Hawick's personal messenger, carrying a sealed letter from Coldwick, which was 12 miles east and contained, according to Percival's contacts, a banking agent who specialized in digging up old financial records for interested parties. Hawick had been busy. Ilara went to find Percival. He was in the small administrative chamber off the main corridor, surrounded by a fortnight of redirected schedules and correspondence that had ceased to reflect any recognizable reality. He looked up when she knocked, with the expression of a man who had been expecting further complications since the morning, and was receiving one now. "I need 10 minutes with the Duke this evening," Ilara said. "Tonight, before anything else happens." Percival set down his pen. He assessed her for one careful moment, the particular assessment of a man who had served the Reinhardt household for 11 years and had learned to distinguish between requests that were important and requests that were urgent and requests that were both. "After supper," he said. "The study. I'll let him know." "Thank you." "Miss Vane." She stopped at the door. The last time someone was honest with His Grace without calculating the effect first. Percival paused. "He responds well to it, that is all I'll say." She told him everything in under 4 minutes, standing in the middle of the study while the fire threw warm light across the maps of the Ashenvale estate. She told him plainly without apology, the way she had decided to tell it. The debt, the field, the boundary dispute, Hawick's arrival, and what she believed he intended to do with it. When she finished, Calder looked at her with an expression that had not shifted into pity or alarm. He looked more focused than before. "I do not confuse circumstance with character," he said. "And then, thank you for telling me directly." She breathed out. "Hawick Fen," he said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet, "is going to find that the information he gathered today has a shorter lifespan than he expected." "You don't need to involve yourself," she said quickly. "I didn't tell you so you would fight this for me. I told you so that the version you heard first was the true one." "I understand that," he said, "but I am involved." He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without embellishment, simply as fact. as if involved were not a declaration, but a description of something that had already happened, that he was only now naming. The fire shifted. The maps on the wall cast long shadows across the shelves of ledgers, the worn edges of the ancient desk. She turned to go. At the door she stopped. "Your Grace." She did not look back, not yet. "For what it's worth, the thing Lady Petra said about you, about not being present." A pause. "You have been present every moment of the last 3 days. I wanted you to know that I noticed." She walked out. In the study behind her, Calder Reinhardt stood for a long time looking at the map of his estate. Every field and boundary and road he knew better than the lines of his own hand, and felt something shift in him that was not a decision yet, but was very close. Thursday arrived with gray skies and a tension that had been building in the keep's stone walls for 3 days, pressed there by too many competing desires and not enough honest speech. Howick came to breakfast looking satisfied. That was the first sign. Satisfied was different from pleasant. Elara saw it the moment she entered the dining hall. She took her seat beside Tilda, poured her tea, and let the morning move around her. The second sign came 30 minutes later, when Lady Mirabelle asked the table whether anyone had heard about the old trust accounts some families kept in the Edinburgh banks, the kind that went dormant when their holders died, the kind that created such confusion regarding assets and obligations, and what, precisely, a person had disclosed about their financial circumstances. She addressed it to no one in particular. She had aimed it with precision. "Miss Vane," Howick said pleasantly, when the silence had stretched enough, "I wonder, did your father keep accounts in Edinburgh? I seem to recall hearing something about a sealed trust, quite old, established when you were very young." The room went still. Elara looked at him. He smiled. It did not reach his pale eyes. Only curiosity. It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to know what someone had access to, what they might have chosen not to mention, when presenting themselves as a candidate without resources. It was a clever trap. She could see the shape of it clearly, take a true fact, there was money she hadn't disclosed, and reframe it as deliberate deception. Make her look like a woman who had performed poverty to generate interest. Make everything she had said and done in the past 4 days look like strategy. Elara set down her cup. She looked at Howick Fenn across the table, and she felt the fear try to rise in her, the old familiar cold of being seen too clearly by someone who means to use what they see. And she breathed through it, and it subsided, because she had already done the only thing that mattered. She had already told him first. "Lord Fenn," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, "I don't know what information you've collected about my family's finances, but I can tell you that His Grace has been fully informed of my circumstances since 2 evenings ago. There are no surprises to be deployed here. There are no surprises to be deployed here." The silence that followed was the kind that meant something was breaking, not shattering but cracking cleanly, like ice giving way along a fault line it had always carried. Howick's smile did not disappear immediately. Men like him were too practiced for that. But something went out of it, like a flame taken off its wick, still shaped like fire but no longer burning. At the head of the table, Calder set down his cup. "Lord Fenn," he said, "I wonder if we might speak privately after breakfast. You and Lady Mirabelle both." He said it the way he said most things. No warmth, no ice. Simply a fact being stated. "There are some matters regarding conduct in this household that I'd like to address." The dining hall went very quiet. Mirabelle looked at Howick. Howick looked at Calder. Whatever he found in the Duke's face was enough to make him nod once, short and controlled, and return his attention to his plate. Delia Farrow, 3 seats from Elara, reached for the bread with an expression of profound private satisfaction. Lord Cecil Barton looked at the table, then at the ceiling, then at his sister Gwen, who was pressing her fingers to her mouth to conceal what appeared to be a smile. And Tilda, small 17-year-old Tilda, who had sat beside Alara through every difficult breakfast of the past 3 years with the loyalty of someone who had simply decided, kicked her gently under the table. "Well done," the kick said. "Well done." The account had existed for 14 years. Alara's father had opened it when she was 8 years old, had walked into a bank in Edinburgh on a Tuesday in early spring, while her mother thought he was in a meeting with his solicitor, and had established a sealed trust in his only daughter's name. He had put money into it quietly, over years, in amounts small enough not to draw notice, saying nothing to anyone. He had died without giving the instruction to release it. The account had been sitting in Edinburgh, sealed and untouched, while Alara had spent 2 years trying to hold together an estate she thought was sinking, managing a debt she thought was terminal, standing in corners and stitching hems and believing she had nothing. She read Percival's note 3 times. Then she walked to the stables. He was there with his horse, a large gray animal named Flint, who had the temperament of a creature that had witnessed everything and was impressed by none of it. Calder was not riding. He was simply standing beside him, the way he stood in the east garden before dawn, present and quiet and asking nothing from the moment. He turned at the sound of her footsteps on the stable floor. She held out the note. He took it. He read it. His expression shifted once, sharply, precisely, a single movement like a sword finding its mark, and then settled. "You didn't know," he said. "I had no idea." Her voice was steady. She had made it steady on the walk from the house, and she was keeping it that way by the kind of effort that looks like nothing from the outside. "He was protecting me the only way he knew how. He didn't want me to know the whole financial picture. He didn't want me to carry it. He wanted you to be 8 years old for a little longer." She didn't say that. It was too close. "The debt can be resolved," she said. "The Eastern Field, the lender, all of it. If the account is released, it resolves everything. For 2 years I have been managing a problem that had a solution I simply didn't know existed." Calder folded the note, put it in his coat pocket. "Howick was going to use this to claim I had concealed assets," she said. "Hidden resources, deliberate deception." "I know." His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. "It won't." He was clever about it. "The construction is solid. Take something true?" "Alara." Her name in his voice, plain and complete, like a door opening. "I know you didn't know. I have spent 4 days watching you. You move toward problems. You don't construct them. Everything about how you have moved through this week is the opposite of strategy." He paused. "Howick's version requires you to be a kind of person you are not. I don't need a letter from Edinburgh to tell me that." She breathed in. Outside, Flint shifted his great gray weight and blew a slow breath into the cold air. In the far stalls, 2 of the other horses moved, their hooves quiet on the straw. The stable smelled of hay and horse and the kind of warmth that belongs to large, patient animals who have learned to wait out winters. "After I speak to Howick and Mirabelle," Calder said, "I need to speak to you, tonight. Somewhere proper, not the garden." She looked at him. Something about the way he said it, "somewhere proper, not the garden," made her chest do something she was not prepared to examine closely, as though the garden had been for learning each other, and somewhere proper was for something else, something that required walls. "There is something I want to say," he said, "and I would like to say it without frost on the ground." "All right," she said. She walked back to the keep. The cold air filled her lungs on every breath, clean and sharp, and the sky above the walls had gone pale gold at the edges where the clouds were thinning. Spring, the color said. Not yet, but coming. The kind of light that remembered what warmth was and was beginning to practice. She stopped on the steps and looked back. He was still standing in the stable doorway, watching her go, with the quiet, undefended attention of a man who had stopped pretending he did not care about what he was watching. She turned away before either of them had to decide what to do about it. He had them removed the following morning. She did not witness the conversation. No one was invited to, but she heard about it in pieces, the way news travels through a household that is pretending not to be paying attention. Howick Fenn had been in the Duke's study for 40 minutes, and had left looking like a man who had miscalculated the weight of the thing he was carrying, and discovered it too late. Lady Mirabelle had been summoned separately, and had emerged from the meeting with her composure still assembled, which was more than could be said for the warmth beneath it. By noon, both of them were gone. Tilda reported this from the window seat with the calm satisfaction of someone watching a board game resolved correctly. Delia came to the sitting-room doorway, looked at Elara for a moment and said, "Good," and then left. It was, Elara thought, an extraordinary sentence from Delia, complete, unambiguous, and entirely unprecedented. Lord Cecil Barton toasted the empty chairs at luncheon and said it was an improvement to the room's general atmosphere. At 4 in the afternoon, Percival knocked on the sitting-room door. "Miss Vane, His Grace would like to speak with you if you are free. The library." She was free. She had been free for the past 4 hours and had been failing, with great effort, to think about anything except whether she was free. The library was warm when she arrived. The fire built up properly for the first time since she discovered it, candles lit against the early dark of a winter afternoon. Calder was standing near the northern window with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, looking out at the courtyard where the torches were just beginning to be lit. He turned when she came in. The candlelight changed his face, made the gray of his eyes warmer, or perhaps she was the one doing that. "Sit down," he said. Not a command. An invitation. There was a difference in the way he said things, and she had learned to hear it. She sat. He remained standing, but it was not a posture of power. It was the posture of a man organizing what he wanted to say. "I owe you an apology," he said. She hadn't expected that. "The selection," he said. "The manner of it. Standing you up in front of 30 people and pointing at you. I told you at the time I was sorry for the execution and not the intent. I still believe that. But I should have said more clearly that I understood what it cost you." He paused. There is a difference between intending no harm and causing none. She looked at her hands. "I survived it." "You shouldn't have had to survive it." Something in his voice had gone softer, though it was not a softness she'd heard from him before. It was the softness of someone who has given a great deal of thought to a thing and has arrived at an honest conclusion. You had spent years making yourself invisible to avoid exactly that kind of moment, and I undid that in one room in under 3 minutes. "You saw me," she said quietly. "I did. I don't know if it's possible to complain about being seen." He almost smiled. That near smile she was beginning to recognize, beginning to want, the way the body begins to want warmth before it fully acknowledges the cold. "I came to Ashenvale in January," he said, "because my grandmother gave me a choice between attending a selection or finding out what happens when the Dowager Duchess Heloise runs out of patience. I had not come looking for anything. I had not looked for anything in years." He turned from the window. "And then I walked into the great hall and saw you stitching a hem in the corner, and something I had been very successfully managing for a long time stopped being manageable." The candle near the window guttered in a draught and steadied again. "I don't know what this becomes," he said. "I am not a person who promises things he can't make true. I won't perform certainty I don't have." He looked at her directly, without the managing, without the wall. "But I know that I have not looked at a room correctly in 8 years, and 4 days ago I looked at a corner and saw you, and every conversation since has confirmed that what I thought I saw was real." Elara's hands were still in her lap. The fire made its small sounds. The keep was quiet around them in the particular way it was quiet after something important had been said. A quality of waiting, as though the old stones were listening. "I am not accustomed to being wanted," she said finally. In the plain way, not as something useful, not as a solution to a problem. Just wanted. Her voice was very steady. She had decided it would be. "I'm not sure I know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," he said. "I'm not asking for an answer. I'm telling you where I stand, so you have the full picture, the way you give people the full picture." She looked up at him. In the candlelight, his face was entirely open. No performance, no management, no careful distance. Just a man who had decided to stop protecting himself and was standing there in the uncovered state of it, waiting. She felt her whole chest turn over, slow and certain, the way a tide turned. "You are a great deal more difficult than I expected," she said. "I've been told that." "I mean it as, not a complaint." She looked back at her hands. "I had decided you would be either cruel or performative, and I had prepared for both. And you are neither, which is considerably harder to navigate. I'm sorry to be inconvenient." "You're not sorry." "No," he said. "I'm not." She stood. She crossed the distance between them, 3 steps across the library rug, the candle flames bending toward her as she passed, and she looked at him at close range, at the serious, undefended face, the gray eyes that had gone somewhere warmer than storm color in the firelight. "I am not making any decisions tonight either," she said. "I'm only saying that I have not been looked at the way you look at me since before my father died. And I had forgotten what it felt like to be someone's specific thought." Her voice was almost steady. "So, I wanted you to know that you are mine as well." A silence, warm and full. His hand came up, very slowly, with the care of someone doing something for the first time after a long absence, and his fingers found the edge of her wrist. Just there. Just the lightest contact, thumb at the inside of her pulse, as if checking that she was real. Her heart answered him without her permission. "All right," he said very quietly. "All right," she said. Outside, through the narrow library windows, the first snow of the night had begun to fall, soft, unhurried, covering the bare rose stems in the east garden, in a white so clean it looked like grace. The announcement was made in the great hall of Ashenvale Keep on the 14th day of April, when the climbing roses on the east wall had begun their first tentative push of new green against the old stone, and the sky above the northern fjord had decided after a very long winter to be generous. Calder said it plainly. He did not perform it. He did not make a ceremony of it. He stood in the assembled company of everyone who remained, Lord Cecil and Lady Gwen, who had stayed because Cecil found the whole situation genuinely interesting, and Gwen had admitted to Tilda that she was hoping for exactly this outcome, and the Dowager Duchess Heloise, who had known since the first morning in the East Garden, and had simply been waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion, and Lady Farrow and her daughters, who had been navigating a complex topology for the books. He stood among all of them and said that he intended to offer a formal proposal to Elara Vane and that she had accepted. Tilda made a sound that was definitely not ladylike and covered it with both hands, then seized Elara's arm and held on. Delia sat very straight and looked at the middle distance with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the exact architecture of one. The bones of it present, committed. Lady Farrow looked at Elara for a long moment. What passed between them was complicated and layered, and would take years to fully resolve, but it was not hostile. Not anymore. The Edinburgh account was released that same month. The debt was cleared. The Eastern Field boundary dispute resolved within 3 weeks, partly through the proper legal channels, partly through what Percival noted dryly was the remarkable acceleration that land disputes achieved when one party became engaged to a duke. On the morning of the wedding, Tilda came to Elara's room before anyone else and sat on the bed's edge and talked continuously about nothing in particular, which was her way of making sure there was no space for nerves to settle. It worked. Delia appeared at the door 20 minutes before the ceremony. She looked at Elara in the deep gold dress, her mother's, properly altered now, taken in and hemmed correctly, and she straightened the small pearl button at Elara's wrist that had come slightly loose and stepped back and gave a short, precise nod. It was the most Delia thing that had ever happened, and Elara loved her cousin for it completely. Lady Pharaoh stood in the corridor outside the chapel, and as Elara passed, said quietly, "Just once, just plainly, just for her, your mother would have been proud." She did not embellish it. She did not need to. Elara touched her aunt's hand briefly once and walked on. The chapel at Ashenvale Keep was old stone and cold air, and the smell of beeswax and centuries, and the light came through the high narrow windows in long clean bars that fell across the flags and the wooden pews and the gathered faces, with the indifferent generosity of light that has been doing this for a very long time. Calder was standing at the front. He turned when she came in. He looked at her the way he had looked at the corner of the great hall 2 months ago in the cold receiving light, with the focused, searching attention of a man looking for something specific, but there was nothing searching about it now. He had found what he was looking for. He was simply looking at it, openly, without reserve. She walked toward him. The chapel smelled of pine resin, and old stone and something green coming through the gaps in the walls, the smell of April deciding to mean it this year. Her mother's dress was warm gold in the candlelight, the pearl button properly fastened at her wrist. The ink stain on her thumb was finally, completely gone. She reached him. He took her hand. The ceremony was short and old, and had been said in this chapel by people who meant it fully, and people who meant it partially, and people who had been uncertain what they meant at all. Elara and Calder said the words to each other in the plain, direct way that was the only register either of them had ever really used, and the words landed differently for it, heavier, more permanent, more true. When it was done, he held her hand and looked at her, and the first thing he said, quietly enough that only she heard, was, "I was right." "About what?" "About the coroner." He paused. "About what I saw." She looked at him, at the face that was entirely present, entirely there. Not managing anything, not protecting anything, just the person she had been learning for 2 months, fully and finally himself. "So was I," she said. Outside the chapel, the April air was cool and bright, and the climbing roses on the east wall had pushed their new green canes against the old stone, small and certain and determined. The birds were loud in the bare upper branches of the birch trees. The grounds of Ashenvale Keep stretched in every direction under a sky that had decided at last to be unreservedly generous with its light. Calder's hand was warm around hers. Elara looked out at the east garden, at the roses coming back, at the stone wall they climbed, at the corner of the grounds where the torches still hung unlit in the morning brightness. As she thought about corners, about the people who were placed in them and told to stay, about what happened when someone turned and looked, not with pity, not with obligation, not with the careful charity of someone doing the right thing, but with the specific, undeniable attention of a person who had seen exactly what was there and wanted it, plainly and completely. She had spent years being useful in other people's stories. This one was hers. She held onto his hand and let the April light fall where it would. It fell on everything equally. The first sound Elara heard every morning now was not birdsong. It was the particular thump of small bare feet hitting stone floor, followed by the unsteady but determined rhythm of a 2-year-old who had decided that sleeping past dawn was a waste of perfectly good chaos. Then the door. Always the door. It swung open with the full-bodied commitment that only toddlers and people with nothing to lose could manage, and a small figure in a white nightshirt hurled himself across the bedroom with his arms already reaching before he had fully cleared the threshold. Papa, ta-ta. Elara opened one eye. Beside her, Calder had already moved, had already lifted one arm to catch the small body mid-launch, had already settled the boy against his chest with the ease of a man who had been doing this for 2 years and had stopped pretending he didn't love every moment of it. Little Edric Reinhardt, heir to the Duchy of Ashenvale, tucked himself under his father's jaw with the boneless satisfaction of someone who has arrived exactly where he intended and sees no reason to move. Calder looked at her over the top of their son's dark head. His eyes were warm, warmer than they had been 3 years ago in a cold receiving hall, warmer than Storm Gray had any right to be. They were the eyes of a man who had stopped managing and started living, and the difference showed in every quiet line of his face. "Good morning," those eyes said. She didn't need words either. Breakfast in Ashenvale Keep had changed. It was louder, for one thing. It had a great deal more porridge on the table and considerably more of it on the furniture. Edric had inherited his father's decisive manner and his mother's complete disregard for what other people thought was the appropriate use of a spoon, and the combination produced results that made Percival quietly relocate the good linen to a separate cabinet every morning before the family came down. Calder sat at the head of the table with his son in his lap, a position that had scandalized Lady Farrow on her first visit, and which he had maintained with serene indifference ever since, cutting Edric's bread into precise small pieces while simultaneously reading the morning correspondence that Percival had sorted and stacked with the optimism of a man who believed the Duke might actually get through it before the boy upended. He never did. But he read more of it than he had before Edric arrived, because Edric had inexplicably developed the habit of being very still and quiet during the first 20 minutes of breakfast, sitting against his father's chest with one small fist wrapped in Calder's shirt, watching the world with his mother's thoughtful brown eyes, perfectly content. Elara watched them from across the table and felt it. The thing she still didn't have a name for, 3 years in. Not happiness exactly, though it contained happiness. Not gratitude, though it contained that too. Something older and quieter than either of those words. Something that felt like arriving somewhere she had been moving toward for a long time without knowing it was a place. She had an ink stain on her thumb again. She had been copying out Edric's name in the old northern script the night before, practicing the letter forms she was teaching him, and the ink had done what ink always did. Calder looked up from his correspondence and saw it. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. She pointed her pen at him. "Don't." "I didn't say anything." "You were thinking it." "I am always thinking it." He looked back at his letter with perfect composure. "It means you have been working." "I find it a pause, not unpleasant." Edric looked between his parents with the focused attention of a child cataloging information he didn't yet have the words for. "Ink," he announced, pointing at Elara's thumb. "Yes," she said. "Papa's?" He looked at Calder's hands. "No ink on Papa today," Calder said. Edric considered this with great seriousness, then looked back at his mother with an expression of pure sympathy. "Poor Mama," he said. Calder's composure fractured completely. He pressed his face briefly into his son's hair, and his shoulders shook, and it was the best sound in the world, that sound, that rare and unguarded laugh, belonging entirely to the two of them in the warm breakfast room of a keep that had stopped being only a title and had become sometime in the past 3 years, unmistakably a home. In the afternoons, when the light was good, Elara took Edric to the East Garden. It was his favorite place. She suspected he didn't know it was hers too, not yet. He was to, and his relationship with history was limited to before the porridge and after the porridge, but she thought someday she would tell him. She would sit him on the low stone wall and tell him about a January morning, about frost on the rose stems, and a cup of tea shared between two people who hadn't yet learned what they were to each other. For now he was busy with the roses. They were in full summer bloom, the climbing roses she had watched all winter as bare gray stems, the ones she had watched from the library window while the world felt uncertain, the ones that had been pushing their pale, determined petals against the stone on her wedding morning. They were extravagant now, cream and blush running all the way up the wall to the second-floor window ledges, filling the garden with a sweetness so thick it was almost a sound. Edric stood on his toes and reached for the lowest bloom, with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once been told that things are out of reach. He was so much like his father. He got the rose. Mama, ding. He turned and held it out to her with both hands, solemn and proud, as if presenting a significant document. She took it. She pressed it to her nose and breathed in. "Thank you, my love." He beamed. Her smile, on Calder's face, the combination still capable of undoing her entirely, and immediately turned back to find another one. "He is going to strip the entire wall before September." She hadn't heard him come. She never did. He moved quietly for a large man, always had. But she felt him before she heard him, the warmth of him behind her, the familiar weight of his hand settling on her shoulder. She leaned back. His arms came around her. They stood like that in the afternoon light while Edric conducted his systematic campaign against the rose wall, narrating each acquisition to himself in a running commentary of single words and invented sounds. "He said poor Mama at breakfast," Alara said. "He did." "You laughed?" "I did. No apology. None needed." She turned her face up toward his. At this angle he was all jaw and throat, and the particular expression he only wore here, in this garden, with no one watching, who required managing, open and unhurried, and entirely, completely present. "You are happy," she said. It wasn't a question. It was something she said sometimes, still, because she needed to hear the truth of it out loud, because some part of her that had spent too many years in corners still checked. He looked down at her. Those gray eyes, warm now, gold at the edges in the summer light. The mate bond gold? Tilda had said breathlessly when she'd first noticed it, years ago, and for once she had not been wrong. Looked at her with the focused, undefended attention she had been the specific subject of for 3 years, and still felt in her bones every time. "Yes," he said. Simple, plain, true. The way he said everything that mattered. She turned back to the garden. Edric had abandoned the roses temporarily in favor of a beetle he had discovered on the path, and was crouching over it with his hands on his knees and his entire small body concentrated in the posture of someone encountering a profound mystery. Calder's chin came to rest on top of her head. The roses bloomed against the old stone. The beetle went about its business. And in the east garden of Ashenvale Keep, on a summer afternoon that would never make it into any official record or history or professional memoir, in the place where two people had first learned to share a cup of tea and tell each other the truth, the Reinhardt family stood quietly together in the gold-edged light. Not performing anything. Not managing anything. Just there. Fully and completely there. And it was, Alara thought, watching her son reach for another rose with his father's absolute certainty. Everything. There is a kind of person the world learns to overlook. Not because she is invisible, but because she makes herself easy to ignore. She sits in the corner, She mends the hems. She copies out the lists, fetches the pins, smooths over the small disasters before they become large ones. She does the work that keeps everything running, and she accepts, quietly, that no one will think to thank her for it. She has been told, in 100 small and careful ways, that she is useful, which is not the same as wanted. That she is present, which is not the same as seen. And somewhere along the way, she stops waiting to be chosen, and simply becomes very, very good at being overlooked. This is Ilara's story. But it is also the story of a man who walked into a room full of everything he was supposed to want, and stopped. Not because of strategy, not because of obligation, not because his grandmother had arranged a selection and he had technically agreed to attend. He stopped because something in him, something that had been very successfully managed for a very long time, recognized what was real. A girl with ink on her thumb and a half-stitched hem, and no idea she was the most interesting person in the room. He chose the corner. And in doing so, he changed everything. What this story asks us to believe, what it quietly, stubbornly insists upon, is that the right person will not need you to perform. They will not need you to be polished or presented or standing in the correct place, at the correct angle, in the correct light. They will walk into the room, pass everything arranged for their approval, and find you anyway. Because the truth cannot be dressed up, or lined up, or introduced through the proper channels. It is simply there, in a corner, doing the work, waiting without knowing it is waiting. Ilara spent years being useful in other people's stories. She mended things. She held things together. She made herself small enough to carry without complaint. And she was good at it. Genuinely, quietly good. But goodness is not the same as happiness, and usefulness is not the same as love. What changed her was not being rescued. What changed her was being recognized. There is a difference, and it is everything. The deepest longing of the human heart is not to be impressive. It is not to win the room or claim the title or stand in the most favorable light. It is simply this, to be seen exactly as you are, and to have that be enough. To have someone look at your ink-stained thumb and your mended hem and your careful, quiet way of moving through a world that forgot to count you, and choose you anyway. Not despite those things. Because of them. That is what love at its best is. Not a performance. Not a transaction. Not a lineup of carefully presented options. Just one person turning toward the corner and saying, plainly and completely, "You. I see you. Come forward." If this story made you feel something, whether it was the quiet ache of being overlooked or the warmth of watching someone finally be seen, drop it in the comments. Tell me which moment got you. Was it the corner scene? The garden? The library? I read every single one, and your words are genuinely what keeps these stories coming. If you want more stories like this, ones that believe in the girl no one counted, the love no one expected, the happy ending that was never supposed to happen, hit subscribe and bring a friend along. We have more corners to explore. Thank you for watching.